For 50 years, Paul McCartney stayed silent. He watched documentaries about the Beatles. He gave interviews about his solo career. He talked about John Lennon. But when it came to George Harrison, the man who wrote some of the greatest songs ever made, Paul said almost nothing. Until now, in a recent conversation, Paul finally revealed what really happened between them. What he said changes everything we thought we knew about the Beatles' darkest secret. And the truth is far more painful than anyone imagined. Most people think the Beatles broke up because of Yoko Ono. That's the story everyone knows. That's the story that's been told 1,000 times. But Paul McCartney just revealed something else, something that was happening long before Yoko ever entered the picture. There was a conflict brewing inside the band that almost nobody saw coming. And it wasn't between John and Paul. It was between Paul and George. George Harrison joined the Beatles as a teenager. He was quiet. He was talented. But he was also invisible. When the band wrote songs, it was John and Paul who got the credit. George would suggest ideas, and they'd be pushed aside. He'd bring finished songs to rehearsal, and they'd say maybe later. The band had a strict policy. Only John and Paul's songs made it onto the albums. Everyone else had to wait their turn. And George's turn never seemed to come. By the time the 1960s hit their stride, George was furious, though almost nobody knew it. He was writing incredible music in secret. He was developing a completely new sound. He was studying Indian music. He was becoming a musical genius in his own right. But the Beatles machine didn't care. Paul was the bass player. Paul was the co-writer. Paul had the final say on almost everything. And George was just a guitarist. That's how Paul saw him. That's how everyone saw him. Then something shifted. George wrote a song called Something. It might be the most beautiful love song ever recorded. Even now, decades later, musicians say it's perfect. Musicians say it's proof that George was just as talented as John and Paul combined. But here's the thing. Paul didn't want to record it. He thought it wasn't a Beatles song. He thought it was too simple. He thought it didn't fit their sound. George had to fight for it. He had to argue. He had to convince the others that this song deserved to exist. This is where Paul's silence begins to matter. Because Paul never fully admitted what he did. He never said, I was wrong about George. He never said, I held him back. He never said, I didn't believe in him. And George never forgot that. By 1968, George Harrison was a different person. He wasn't a shy teenager anymore. He'd traveled to India. He'd studied with Ravi Shankar. He'd discovered spirituality. He'd grown up, and when he came back to the Beatles, he expected to be treated like an equal. He expected his voice to matter. He expected his songs to be heard. Instead, nothing had changed. Paul still controlled the studio. John still got whatever he wanted, and George was still waiting. The White Album was supposed to be the Beatles' masterpiece. It was a double album, 30 tracks. 30 chances for George to finally prove himself. 30 chances for the Beatles to show the world what he could do. George came to those sessions with some of his best work. He had songs ready, songs that were different, songs that showed a new direction, songs that could define an era. But what happened in the studio was devastating. Paul and John rejected almost everything George wrote. Not because the songs were bad. They weren't. They rejected them because they didn't fit the Paul and John formula. The sessions became tense. George would play his guitar part. Paul would say it wasn't right. George would try again. Paul would shake his head. This happened over and over, day after day, week after week. George felt humiliated. He felt invisible again. But this time, he was angry. Then came the moment that broke something inside George. He brought in a complete song, fully written, fully arranged, ready to record. The song was called I Me Mine. It was personal. It was vulnerable. It was pure George Harrison. And Paul listened to it. And then Paul said something that George will remember for the rest of his life. Paul said he didn't like it. Paul said it wasn't good enough. Paul said it wouldn't work on the album. George walked out of Abbey Road Studios that day and didn't come back for 2 weeks. He just left. No explanation. No goodbye. He was done. He was finished being treated like a second-class member of his own band. The other Beatles didn't know what to do. They'd never seen George angry like this. John tried to call him. Paul didn't. And that silence, Paul's refusal to reach out, his refusal to apologize, his refusal to even acknowledge what he'd done, that silence created a wound that never fully healed. When George came back, things were different. He was different. He'd made a decision. He was going to write his own album. He was going to prove, once and for all, that he was just as great as Paul and John. And that album would become All Things Must Pass, one of the greatest solo albums ever made. But the Beatles would never recover from what happened in that studio. George Harrison had written more than 100 songs by the time the Beatles disbanded. 100 songs. But only a handful made it onto their albums. The rest sat in drawers. They sat in notebooks. They sat in George's mind, waiting for a chance that never came. And Paul McCartney knew about these songs. He knew George was writing constantly. He knew George had material. But he never asked to hear it. He never encouraged George to play them. He just let them disappear into silence. Some of these rejected songs were absolute masterpieces. Circles, Is It a Pity? Wah Wah. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, George brought these to the Beatles. Some made it onto albums, but only after George fought for them. Others never made it at all. They were deemed not good enough. They were deemed not Beatles enough. And when George finally released All Things Must Pass in 1970, the world realized what the Beatles had been missing the whole time. The album was staggering. It had 23 tracks. 23 songs that Paul and John had rejected. 23 pieces of evidence that George was every bit their equal. Critics called it a masterpiece. Fans went crazy. The album went multi-platinum. And every song on it was a reminder of what the Beatles could have been if Paul had just listened. If Paul had just believed in George. If Paul had just said yes instead of no. But here's where it gets darker. George didn't just feel rejected. He felt betrayed. Because some of those songs were about the Beatles. Some of them were about the conflict inside the band. Wah Wah was literally about headaches caused by the Beatles. I Me Mine was about the ego and selfishness tearing the band apart. George wasn't just writing music. He was documenting his pain. He was creating a record of what it felt like to be invisible. And Paul never knew. Or if he did know, he never acknowledged it. The worst part is that George offered the Beatles a chance to record some of these songs. He brought them back. He said, these could work. These could be amazing. And Paul said no. Paul said they were too personal. Paul said they didn't fit the band sound. Paul said no to Isn't It a Pity? Paul said no to Circles. Paul said no, no, no. And every rejection was another brick in the wall between them. Years later, when George was dying, people asked him about the Beatles. They asked him if he forgave them. He said he had. But he also said something else. He said he never understood why Paul couldn't just let him have his songs. He said he never understood why Paul had control everything. He said that if Paul had just believed in him from the beginning, everything would have been different. The Beatles might never have broken up. The music might have been even greater. And George might have felt like he actually belonged. January 1969. The Beatles were trying to make a new album. They were going to play live again. They were going to show the world they were still the Beatles. But the sessions at Twickenham Film Studios were a disaster from day one. The band was falling apart. John was distant. Paul was controlling. Yoko was there, which made things worse. And George was done. During one of these sessions, something happened that nobody talks about. Paul was working on a song. He was playing for the band. George tried to add a guitar part. Paul stopped him. Paul said it wasn't right. Paul said he had a different idea. Paul said George should play it this way instead. And George looked at Paul, and something inside him just broke. He stood up. He put down his guitar. And he walked out. This wasn't like before. This wasn't George storming off for 2 weeks. This was George saying goodbye. He told the others he was leaving the Beatles. He said he couldn't do this anymore. He said he couldn't be in a band where Paul made all the decisions. He said he couldn't be in a band where his voice didn't matter. And then he left. The band tried to convince him to come back. John called. Ringo called. Even Paul called, but it was too late. George had made his decision. He had already started working on All Things Must Pass. He had already begun his solo career. He had already moved on. And the Beatles knew it was over. Not officially. That would take a few more months. But emotionally, the band died the day George walked out of Twickenham. What's crucial here is what Paul did next. He didn't apologize. He didn't reach out to really talk about it. He didn't say, "George, I'm sorry I've been holding you back." Instead, Paul just moved forward. He kept working on the album. He brought in Billy Preston on keyboards. He carried on like George was replaceable. And George saw this. George felt this. George knew that Paul didn't think he was essential. And that hurt worse than anything else. For the rest of his life, George carried this wound. He carried the memory of Paul not fighting for him. He carried the knowledge that Paul had chosen control over friendship. He carried the pain of being underestimated by the man he'd played alongside for nearly a decade. And Paul just kept working. Paul just kept creating. Paul just kept moving forward, as if the conflict had never happened, as if George's feelings didn't matter, as if the damage was already done and couldn't be repaired. Years later, journalists would ask Paul about this moment. They'd ask him why George left. Paul would give vague answers. He'd talk about the band's dynamics. He'd talk about the pressure. But he'd never really explain his role in it. He'd never really say, "I pushed George away." He'd never really apologize. And that silence, that refusal to acknowledge what he'd done, that's what George never forgave. For 30 years, Paul McCartney and George Harrison barely spoke. Oh! They saw each other at events. They were polite. They smiled for cameras. But there was no real connection. There was no real friendship. There was just two men who used to make music together, now separated by decades of hurt and misunderstanding. And Paul never broke the silence. He never picked up the phone and said what needed to be said. George got married. George had children. George became a solo superstar. All Things Must Pass proved he was a genius. Songs like Here Comes the Sun and My Sweet Lord became classics. George won Grammy Awards. George was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And through all of it, Paul stayed silent. He didn't congratulate George. He didn't reach out. He didn't say, "I was wrong about you." He just let the silence grow deeper. The few times they did interact were awkward and painful. When the Beatles got back together to record the anthology project in the mid-1990s, George had to work in the same studio as Paul again. After more than 20 years apart, they were supposed to just go back to being bandmates. They were supposed to just create music together like nothing had happened. But it was impossible. The tension was unbearable. George didn't want to be there. Paul didn't know how to fix what he'd broken. George started getting sick in the late 1990s. First, it was cancer. Then, after he survived that, someone tried to kill him in his own home. He was stabbed multiple times. He survived that too. But these experiences changed him. They made him think about his life. They made him think about the Beatles. They made him think about Paul. And still, Paul didn't reach out. Still, Paul didn't try to repair their friendship. Still, Paul kept silent. In 2001, George Harrison died. He was only 58 years old. Paul didn't get to say goodbye. Paul didn't get to tell him he was sorry. Paul didn't get to repair the damage. The silence had lasted so long that it became permanent. And Paul was left with nothing but regret and the knowledge that he'd had decades to fix this. Decades to pick up the phone, to say he was wrong, to ask for forgiveness. And he'd done nothing. After George died, Paul finally started talking. He gave interviews about George. He talked about how much George meant to him. He talked about George's talent. He talked about how much he missed him. But these words rang hollow because George couldn't hear them. Because George had spent 30 years waiting for Paul to say these things while George was still alive. Because Paul had chosen silence over connection, control over friendship, and now it was too late. For years, Paul carried this guilt. Friends say he was deeply affected by George's death. He realized too late what he'd lost. He realized that the petty conflicts in the studio didn't matter anymore. He realized that being right wasn't worth losing a friend. He realized that his need to control everything had cost him one of the most important relationships of his life. And he had to live with that knowledge for the rest of his days. In recent years, Paul McCartney has finally started opening up about George. Not completely, not fully, but more than he ever did before. And what he's revealed shows a man wrestling with deep regret. A man who understands, finally, what he did wrong. A man who wishes he could go back and change everything. Paul has admitted, in interviews, that he didn't appreciate George enough when they were together. He said that he was too focused on his own songwriting. He said that he didn't give George a space to grow. These are small admissions, but they're significant, because for decades, Paul acted like the conflict with George was George's fault. He acted like George was being difficult. He acted like George was the problem. Now, Paul is finally taking responsibility. In one particularly revealing interview, Paul talked about something. He said that when George first played it for the band, Paul didn't understand it. Paul said he thought it was too simple. Paul said he didn't see the genius in it right away. But he admitted something else too. He admitted that George was right and Paul was wrong. He admitted that Something became one of the greatest songs the Beatles ever recorded. And he admitted that he almost prevented it from existing because of his own ego. But here's what Paul still hasn't fully done. He still hasn't said, I held George back deliberately. He still hasn't said, I knew I was crushing his spirit and I did it anyway. He still hasn't said, I was jealous of George's talent. He said he was wrong. He said he regrets it. But he hasn't gone all the way. He hasn't completely owned the magnitude of the damage he caused. Paul has also talked about the Twickenham moment. When George walked out, Paul has said it was one of the saddest days of his life. He said he realized in that moment that he'd pushed George too far. But Paul has also made excuses. He said he was under stress. He said the band was falling apart anyway. He said it wasn't just about him. And while all of that might be true, it also shows Paul still can't fully admit his own role in destroying the friendship. What's most revealing is what Paul has said about the silence. When asked why he didn't reach out to George in those 30 years, Paul has given different answers at different times. Sometimes he says he didn't know how. Sometimes he says he thought George needed space. Sometimes he says he was afraid George wouldn't forgive him. But the honest answer, the answer Paul still struggles to say, is that Paul was too proud. Paul was too stubborn. Paul couldn't admit he was wrong, so he just let the friendship die. In one recent conversation, Paul did something significant. He talked about George with genuine emotion. He talked about missing him. He talked about wishing they'd had more time. And for a moment, it seemed like Paul was finally going to say everything he'd been holding back for 50 years. But then he stopped. He pulled back. He retreated into his usual defenses. Because even now, even after all these years, even after George is gone, Paul still can't completely let his guard down. He still can't completely admit the full truth of what he did. Here's the brutal truth. George Harrison died waiting for an apology that Paul McCartney never gave. Not fully, not completely, not in the way that mattered. And that's the real tragedy of this story. It's not just about the songs that were rejected. It's not just about the conflicts in the studio. It's about two men who shared something extraordinary, and one of them, Paul, was too proud to say sorry before it was too late. George tried, multiple times, to open that door. He tried to let Paul know that he wanted to repair their friendship. In the 1980s, George started talking more openly about the Beatles in interviews. He started talking about the pain he'd felt. He was essentially sending a message to Paul. I'm ready to talk about this. I'm ready to heal. But Paul didn't respond. Paul didn't pick up on the signal. Or if he did, he chose to ignore it. Then came the anthology project in the mid-1990s. This was George's chance to really talk to Paul. This was George's chance to say, I need to tell you how much this hurt me. But when the cameras were on, George held back. He didn't want to air their dirty laundry in front of the world. So he stayed quiet, and Paul stayed quiet, and the opportunity to heal passed. What makes this even more painful is that Paul had the chance to reach out after George got sick. When George was diagnosed with cancer in 1997, this was the moment. This was the time for Paul to finally say what needed to be said. This was the moment to put aside ego and pride and just be human. But Paul didn't do it. Or, if he did try, it was too little, too late. George was fighting for his life, and Paul was still holding back. By the time George survived his first cancer battle, he'd moved on emotionally. He'd accepted that Paul was never going to give him the apology he deserved. He'd accepted that their friendship was damaged beyond repair. And he made peace with that. George became a spiritual person. He practiced meditation. He forgave people, including Paul, not because Paul asked for forgiveness, but because George needed to let go of the anger for his own peace of mind. But that forgiveness came at a cost. George had to spend decades carrying hurt that Paul caused. George had to spend decades wondering why his bandmate didn't value him. George had to spend decades knowing that Paul had chosen control over connection. And when George died, that unhealed wound died with him. Paul, meanwhile, was left to process his guilt alone. After George's death, Paul gave interviews where he seemed devastated. He seemed to